Hi everyone, my name's Eli, and today we're going to be learning about relative pronouns in German. We're going to learn what a relative pronoun actually is. We're going to learn to use relative pronouns in German. There's also going to be several revision sections throughout this PowerPoint, so that you can have a go at using relative pronouns yourself, and make sure you're keeping up with what we're doing. First of all, what is a relative pronoun? Relative pronouns are words like who, that, and which, and they join together two related clauses, or two related ideas. Here's an example of two clauses without a relative pronoun. Peter brought a shirt. The shirt looks really cool. See how both of these clauses are related, because they're both referring to the shirt. Peter bought a shirt. The shirt looks really cool. They're both referring to that same shirt. We can actually join those two sentences together with a relative pronoun. Peter bought a shirt that looks really cool. Notice how it says and means exactly the same thing, but we've substituted the shirt with the relative pronoun that. Also notice that that refers to the shirt in the same way that the shirt in the first example refers to the shirt in the first clause of the first example. Let's have a look at what this does to the sentences themselves. Notice how originally Peter bought a shirt. The shirt looks really cool. There were two separate clauses. Well, when you use a relative pronoun, they're joined together into the same sentence. But they're not the same clause, but we'll look at that later. Here's another example. Bella has a dog. The dog is very friendly. Notice that there's no relative pronoun there, and notice that there are two separate clauses that are related. They're both talking about the dog. Here's an example with a relative pronoun. Bella has a dog which is very friendly. Notice once again how which is standing in. You can imagine that it's substituting in for the dog up here. Also notice that which is relating to the dog in the same way that the dog up here is related to this dog here. They're both which refers to that dog. Now that is known as the antecedent, or the dog in that example is known as the antecedent. It's the thing that the relative pronoun is referring to. A dog is the antecedent of the relative pronoun which. There's also a thing called a relative clause in this example with the relative pronoun. The relative clause contains the information that the relative pronoun introduces. So it's this bit here, which is very friendly. That's the relative clause. Up here in the first example, there are two main clauses, but down here in the second example, there is a main clause, then there is the relative clause that is introduced by the relative pronoun which. Here's an example for you to try. Roger, who was very unfit, ran every morning. So what's the relative pronoun in this example? Well, the relative pronoun is who. Who is one of our relative pronouns? See? Who. Up here. What is the antecedent of our relative pronoun who? What is who referring to? Roger, who was very unfit, ran every morning. Our relative pronoun is referring to Roger. So Roger is the antecedent of the relative pronoun who. Okay, looking at this example still, where is our relative clause in here? Where is the information that the relative pronoun has introduced? Right there, in between those two commas. Roger, who was very unfit, ran every morning. That bit in there is the relative clause because it's the information that the relative pronoun has introduced. Also note that the main clause continues before and after the relative clause. Now using relative pronouns in German. In German, they use the same word for that, which, and who. Or in other words, they don't distinguish between objects and people. In English you can't say, the book who has lots of pages. It'd be the book that has lots of pages. In German, they don't make this distinction, and they use the same word for that, which, and who. So you don't have to worry about that. Now, the relative pronoun itself is the article of the antecedent, or the thing that the relative pronoun is referring to. For example, it's going to be a der or die or a das, because those are the articles. So if der man is the antecedent, the relative pronoun is going to be der. Okay? Here's another example. The dog, that is brown, can run fast. Der Hund, der braun ist, kann schnell laufen. We have a masculine antecedent, which is der Hund, so the relative pronoun is der. Die Frau, die einen Apfel gekauft hat, ist glücklich. We have a feminine antecedent, so the relative pronoun is die. Remember, the relative pronoun is referring to this woman, the woman who has bought an apple is happy. Here's another example. Das Auto, das ich habe, ist kaputt. We have a neuter antecedent, so our relative pronoun is das. Also note that a comma is always used to introduce a relative clause. A comma is also used to terminate the relative clause if it is not the end of the entire sentence. Just like in English. For example, das Kleid, das nett ist teuer. We can see that a comma has been used to introduce our relative clause. It comes before our relative pronoun. And that we also have used a comma to terminate our relative clause, because it's not the end of the whole idea. Also note that the verb ist is at the end of the relative clause. That is because in a relative clause, the verb moves to the end in its finite form or in its conjugated form. There's ist. Another example, note the position of the commas, one to introduce the relative clause before the relative pronoun das, and one to end the relative clause, because it's not the end of the whole idea. Also note that habe is at the end of the relative clause, and that it is habe, not haben, or anything else, because it still has to agree with the subject, which is ich. There it is. Revision time. In this little revision section, you need to fill in the relative pronoun that we're going to use. But because you don't have pens and paper, I'll just talk you through it. So here, what is our antecedent? What is the thing we're referring to? Well, we're referring to der Hund, so the relative pronoun is going to be der, because that is the article of the noun. It's a masculine noun, so it's going to be der. Der Hund, der braun ist klein. In the next example, die Katze, that is brown, is big. What is the antecedent of our relative pronoun? Well, it's die Katze. We're referring to the cat. Die Katze is a feminine noun, so our relative pronoun is going to be die. Das Auto is the antecedent in the third example. It's the thing we're referring to. So the relative pronoun is going to be das. In this last example, that is Mr. Martin, who works in the kitchen. What is our antecedent here? Well, we're referring to Herr Martin, and he's masculine. He is a der word, so the relative pronoun is going to be der. Now, what do we do with commas when we're using relative pronouns? Well, a comma is always used to introduce a relative clause. It comes before the relative pronoun. And a comma is used to terminate the relative clause, unless it's the end of the whole idea, where we can just use a full stop, or an exclamation mark, or whatever you you choose to use. What about verbs when we're using relative clauses? Well, the verb moves to the end of the relative clause in its finite form, or its conjugated form, or its agree with the subject form. If it's ich, and we're using haben, the verb has to be habe. Now, the relative pronoun changes based on its case in the relative clause. For example,